I think it's reasonable to assume that they must have seen something floating in the water and went to salvage it and got caught in the process. But, you know, who knows? We don't know.
It's just got a fascination of its own, and the islands have got their own fascination, the weirdness and the wildness and the loneliness.
They must have heard something going on outside, like something breaking or a crane breaking, and whatever happened was very sudden. I can't come up with an explanation.
A lightkeeper's duty actually was 24 hours a day. Anything that went wrong at the station had to be seen to, had to be taken care of. The light, the fog signal, that was first on the agenda before anything else was thought of. Some of the isolated stations where you were relying on reliefs or boats for bringing provisions or such like, well, you had to rely then on weather. All the work at the stations was done by the three keepers. So you did that, and sometimes during the summer, the likes of the outside painting, you would actually work in the afternoon as well to get it all cleared. But they were responsible for the whole upkeep. Most important, of course, was the maintenance of the light and the engines.
There was a chain, a clockwork type of mechanism which you had to wind up roughly about every half hour. That had to be kept going so that the signal shown to mariners was correct at all times. If the light was to stop at all, that would mean there was something wrong, and mariners, as I said, seafarers, would get the wrong signal. That was an offence which was punishable by instant dismissal.
I think you had to be a certain character. You had to be quite self-sufficient, and you had to be quite content within yourself. There was no point being somebody who liked to be gregarious life and soul, off to the pub every night and be a lighthouse keeper. Certainly if you were working on a rock station where you were away from the local community, you were even away from your family, you were there with the three guys for sort of 4-6 weeks. And you just had to get on with it. And the job was the most important. It was a 24-hour-day job, if you like. You were always there, although you worked a shift basis, you were always there living on the job. And I think you had to be quite a singular kind of person to cope with that.
The trouble wasn't being on your own too much, it was being with other people too much in very cramped surroundings. So you had to be able to deal with people very well, I think, and you also had to be able to deal with the sea.
I would think in severe weather it would have been a frightening existence at times, especially, you know, with the weather, and we get it here. We get severe weather at times, but when you consider that this is another 20 miles further west and right in the open, there must be horrendous weather out there at times, especially some horrendous wave action.
A ship was going by and discovered that there was no light on the Flannan Isles, where there ought to be one. And when the matter was investigated, they found the island and the lighthouse unoccupied, and the three men had disappeared.
The Hesperus, which was the relief boat then, was notified, but it was very, very stormy. And as I understand it, the Hesperus was in Loch Rogue here for a number of days before she could sail to see what was what. And that's when the imagination boggles as to what the people here were feeling. No light, what had happened.
I think in particular case of the Flannans, it's important that the Flannan's Isles light had just been established a few months before the disappearance of the three keepers. And it may be that the keepers were not entirely familiar with the local conditions. Throughout the lighthouse service, it was the local lighthouse keeper's decision as to whether the ships made a landing or not. It wasn't up to the captain of the lighthouse vessel. It was the principal keeper who said, yes, the landing is safe. And it may be it was early days at the Flannans, a newly established station. They didn't have that familiarity with it yet, but who knows?
I read one account where one of the men wrote in a diary that one of the other keepers was irritable for 2 or 3 days. Now that might suggest that there was some friction between the men, but that's another story. But it's certainly something that could very easily happen when you have 3 men on a remote island having to live with each other and work with each other all the time.
It is almost impossible, humanly impossible, to find yourself in such a confined space and not end up arguing about who passed the salt in the wrong way or who didn't sweep the doorstep or who sort of whatever it might happen to be. And I think that did happen a lot. There was certainly one murder at Little Ross Lighthouse. I think it was the assistant who murdered the principal keeper.
My father worked there and he had a very bad experience there on one occasion, and he felt that something similar could have happened to people there. He had one man he was working with, there were 3 of them on there of course at a time. One man was very ill, and the other man had a mental breakdown, and the man who had the mental breakdown wanted to kill the other 2, kill my father and the other man, and he had to be tied up for some of the time. My father always felt that something like that could have happened when people are living in isolation, and when these men were there, they were in real isolation for the period because they went to the rock, they went there for a month at a time normally. They had no means of contact with the outside world. Anything that happened, they were on their own.
We now know, with our modern psychological knowledge, that they'd done just about the worst thing you could do. That was putting 3 people together in an isolated situation. Because whenever there's any stress on the relationship, the triadic relationship, what you get is a 2 against 1 situation, which itself is inherently bad because the person who's the wand clearly feels very victimised and the other 2 feel very strong against that person. Now, say for example, let's just speculate that the part-timer, maybe he wasn't up to the job, maybe he wasn't as good at doing the stuff, whatever it was they did, as the other 2. Now that itself might have been a reason for niggles and ill feeling to grow up.
Not only is there something very strange about not finding 3 bodies, but there was something so odd about their manner of disappearance and something so odd about the Flannan Isles themselves. The Flannan Isles are as remote as you can possibly get, so they are quite eerie.
the main thing to remember about the Flannans is a very small group of islands sticking out of the sea some 17.5 miles to the west of the Western Isles. The water comes across the Atlantic some 3,000 miles and then swirls around in fairly deep water around these islands. The main thrust of the tide will push from the southwest to the northeast, but at the same time there's a certain amount of a wash around the islands themselves.
Procedure of landing, well, it could be quite hard, but the officer and crew of the lighthouse ships rather, they were excellent seamen. Our life was in their hands quite frequently, really, any time going ashore and coming off. They dropped an anchor and gradually worked their way in towards the rock until a heaving line from the keepers on the landing was able to get to the boat. The keeper coming onto the island would sit on a piece of wood. He wasn't tied to this line at all, and then he was hauled by the keepers on the shore while the seamen in the boat gradually released the rope, the line they were holding.
There's recent evidence from one of the floating oil platforms west of the Shetlands. They were looking at a heave at a distance of the wave from trough to peak of 52 meters. That's wild weather.
In the winter you were got very severe storms. Sometimes you couldn't get out, you couldn't open a door for 2 or 3 days. Very heavy seas.
The Flannan Isles are very exposed and very open to the waves of the Western Ocean. Even in moderate weather, you can expect to have a fair-sized wave breaking on the shore. The seas there are almost always unpredictable. You see, the rollers coming in there are not regular. Fishermen here, from time immemorial, discovered that there are cross tides in the Western Ocean. And because of that, when these tides cross each other, they create new waves. They create bigger waves and sometimes smaller waves. But these big rollers keep rolling along. They may be coming in from a storm in the Western Atlantic 1,000 miles from here.
The two keepers had gone out to their normal morning task. The one who was the cook, he would have been left to tidy up the quarters and such like. And they'd gone down to the landing to secure a crane, I think, that had come loose, or even just to check the landing to see that everything was secure. And one of the fellas had probably got washed off, and the other man had run back to the station to get help from the other keeper. And in trying to make a rescue of the first one, they had both been subsequently caught by one of these freak waves.
Well, I gather that what they found there, that the oilskins, or the outdoor gear of the two, Marshall and Duckett, I think the names were. They were missing, but the outdoor gear of Donald MacArthur was there. And it seems likely that if the storm, they'd been stormbound for 3 days, and there was a lot of damage, that the other two had gone out to try and sort something, tidy up something or save something, and Donald was inside, and he must have seen something, this huge wave coming or something like that perhaps, and he would be a local man and knew the danger, and perhaps he rushed out to tell them to be careful, and they were all swept away.
I'm convinced, having been to the Flannans, having seen North Atlantic weather, was that the three keepers were washed away by an unexpected wave that caught them by surprise. And it was a tragedy at the time for the local community. It was a tragedy for the lighthouse service. And these men left families behind. And in fact, the principal keeper, Mr. Duckett, his wife, Mary Grierson, died some 5 years later, although still a young woman, actually of a broken heart. There's no other way to describe it.
In the West Coast particularly, we very rarely recover bodies out of the sea. It's quite an unusual event if we actually find people. The body itself will be thrown around by the water very much. The person's life expectancy is very, very limited indeed, and the chances are they'll never be seen again.
The log was kept on a daily basis in the lighthouse, and I think it was the day of the 15th of December that they stopped the log. But there was a slate in the room where the log was kept, where they wrote on the slate prior to writing it in the logbook. Now, on the account that I read, there was one thing on it that said that everything had now been calm and God is over all, which was suggesting that there must have been horrendous weather before and also maybe some trouble, I don't know.
The keeper that was being left on December the 7th asked for additional signalling. He wanted some kind of signal on top of the tower to say all is well, but he was refused that. Now, why is astonishing, but I know the Lighthouse Board weren't the most generous of people, you know, in relation to if it was going to cost anything, but that wouldn't have cost very much. My assumption is that if it was a white flag, all is well. If it was a red flag, all is not well. But whether this keeper had some premonition of what was going to happen, you know, a week or 10 days later, I'm not sure.
There's one story that says that there was an argument outside between two, and the third one went out to try and sort it out. Now, that could very well have happened.
In most cases, it was a happy situation. Sometimes you got somebody that would be kind of awkward, so time on the rock really hung long on your hands.
These people in that situation were in an extreme situation. Some aspect of the situation even, or something happening, or some last slight might have been enough to cause a huge explosion that might have led to a fight and to these people being, well, losing their lives in some way or another.
Before that time, people were abducted and taken over to the plantations in the Caribbean. But at that time, I don't think that sort of thing would happen. But who am I to say?
Having read read reports that were written by Joseph Moore, who was the keeper who first arrived after the disaster. The lighthouse station was all very orderly. The light was ready for use. The beds had obviously been slept in that morning. The fire hadn't been lit. There was no sign of any struggle or argument or what have you there. All the records were up to date. Also, the characters of the men involved, they were picked specifically to go to the Flannans when it was first lit, because it was an important station. So they were quite steady, they knew their jobs.
A lot of times you had to turn a blind eye to the quirks that somebody had, because each one had their... I mean, there was one that he didn't like mashed potatoes. Now, this is silly little things, but in a confined area can be annoying. And if you were cook, which the lightkeeper had to do, you did your fortnight cook. This one in particular didn't like mashed potatoes, so his potatoes had to be taken out of the pan. And immediately he got them on his plate. The first thing he did was mash them up. And, and it was, you know, you could have flipped your lid over that, but that was one of these silly little things. There were some of the stations where the senior keeper would insist on that was his chair. Well, fair enough, I mean, let him get on with it. But things like that, if you're cooped up for a long while, can really grind into you, and if you allow it.
There's a cultural aspect to this as well, because these men were from a culture where men were men, and you didn't actually say anything about how you felt or what grievances you might have, unless things were very extreme. Now, nowadays, in a situation like that, we would say to people, as soon as you have any kind of negative feeling, express it, talk about it, get it out of the way, because it might be quite trivial at the time, but it could become actively dangerous.
I think anything of the nature that is totally insoluble, it cannot be solved, nobody will ever know. It's always bound to leave questions in people's minds. What actually did happen? We never will know, we never can know. But like any mystery of the type, like the Marie Celeste, who knows?
I don't think anybody else will ever have an answer for it. Just one of the mysteries of the sea.